So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to touch on something that's often missing on issues of the day, especially issues that could be related to road safety or road use, and that's the cyclist perspective. And I first noticed this the other day when I realized that in the past few weeks around town and in several of the neighboring towns, I'd seen them putting these orange plastic or synthetic poles on little freestanding platforms on the sides of the road at a lot of intersections. And then I realized, well, why are they doing that? It's because there's a crosswalk there. Now, presumably, what they were afraid of is that cars would be approaching the crosswalk and stop for pedestrians, and people wouldn't realize that's why they were stopping and then try to pass them on the side and cause an accident. Well, rather than sit there and look at this and say, well, why would somebody not realize they're stopping for a pedestrian? Why would somebody think they're stopping for some other reason? Well, because there's a plethora of people stopping without turn signals, and so when somebody stops without a signal, it's almost like you're assuming they're just going to turn. They just haven't used a signal. How do we prevent this without putting Rube Goldberg contraptions right in the way where I'm riding my bike? Well, we could just ticket the jablones who don't use their turn signals, and set up a different set of expectations so that when you see somebody stop dead in the street, if they don't have a turn signal on, the first thing you think of isn't, oh, they're just turning. They just don't have a signal. I'll pass them. Um, Common sense, right? But more to the point, I think, is whether or not you're going to try and actually solve the problem rather than slap band-aids on it. I guess the question becomes, when those band-aids are obstacles that physically block part of the street, why would they put them where I ride my bike? And the answer obviously is they don't realize people are going to be riding there. Now, these are people who are responsible for changing something about the roadways. If they're not even thinking that somebody could be there on their bike, obviously there's a big problem. And this is certainly something that, as a cyclist, when I'm not asking that people, because I also drive and I also walk, I'm not asking that people design everything just around cyclists. What I'm simply saying is that at least consider the fact that we're there, right? Don't act as if we don't exist. But the problem is every time there's any major change to the roadways, they do that. Another classic case, speed bumps, right? I've seen speed bumps put where they're not marked yellow anymore. They're just there. And sometimes they're actually hidden behind the lattice work painted lines of what appears to be some kind of a crosswalk, but it's actually elevated. You just can't see that it's elevated because it's not, when I was growing up, speed bumps were painted a different color than the roadway so you could see them and know they were there. Now, well, they might have a sign on the side of the road that says speed bump, or sometimes they say speed hump, which, sounds kind of vulgar, but whatever. The point is there might be a sign on the road saying that somewhere on that section of the street is a speed bump, but if you don't know exactly where it is and you're riding over it on a bike at 20 miles an hour, well, there's a problem, right? You're going to hit that, and as happened to me some years ago when I was riding to the Tour of Somerville to see the bike race, I rode over one of these things on my road bike, and I crashed because I wasn't expecting the road to suddenly go boing, because I couldn't see it. It wasn't marked clearly the way they should have. Another thing is the speed bumps, might be safe to drive over on a car at 20 miles an hour, but not on a bicycle or even perhaps a motorcycle. So we're going to have to actually slow down to way less than what the actual speed limit is. Did they factor that into designing it? Other things, narrowing roadways with concrete bunkers. I've seen a lot of this where they'll put something, well, we're concerned somebody is going to go over the center line. So even though it's a non-divided controlled access highway, it's a regular street, we're going to put something in the middle just like they do on a divided controlled access highway. Well, the problem is that narrows the road, right? Normally a car's not supposed to go over the center line, but if they have to pass you with safe room, I'd rather they did that if nobody's coming than just buzz right by you and knock you the hell over. Well, what happens when you put a physical object in the middle of the street? Now they can't do that if they have to. They're going to pass you too close and run you off the road or clip you with their side mirror or whatever. It's like not even thinking that we're there. The irony is a lot of the states that basically create what I call tunnel features, things that make it impossible to move over and leave safe room to pass, whether it's an obstacle in the middle of the street, whether it's um, those grooves in the pavement that make a noise if you drive over them, whatever. And all of these things may have some benefit to them in some way, shape, or form. They're obviously put there for a reason. But the point is, when they decide where to put them and so forth, they don't take into account that it's going to have a negative effect for us. And that's the problem. That's the problem. That the acknowledgement or consideration of the viewpoint of the cyclist is just flat out absent. So getting around to what I really wanted to talk about is, why am I not trusting things that are major changes to infrastructure, like, for example, self-driving cars, and the whole rigmarole that surrounds that? Why do I think that we're not going to be given adequate consideration by the programmers, by the people making the rules and laws, by the yada yada? Well, there's the fact that in particular we know we already haven't. I mean, Google was having these things operate on the roads for years, treating every member of the public as a guinea pig, before they even bothered to attempt to address the issue of interacting with cyclists. And when they did, it was by a very unconvincing computer animation that showed a single Google car interacting with a single cyclist. And we know some of the semi-autonomous features that are available in cars now, like Volvo or Tesla, really don't do a great job of reacting to cyclists at all. The lack of consideration that we've already gotten so far, demonstrates that, well, if the same people are going to be involved going forward, obviously their modus operandi isn't going to change. Their way of doing things isn't going to change. So if we've gotten this little consideration so far, we're not going to get any going forward. In particular, just on the issue of, let's say, self-driving cars and everything surrounding that. However, here's something else to consider. If they're not going to bother to take into account the effect on cyclists of putting a plastic pole on the side of the road by a crosswalk, why would they consider the effect on cyclists of completely changing the entire road dynamic by introducing robot cars, right? They won't consider us when it comes to some little issue, something relatively mundane, like where they're putting a cone or a pole or a speed bump. Why the heck on the face of the earth would I believe that they would have any more consideration for us when you're dealing with something like a robot car network, right? Self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, etc. The very fact that we already have gotten over the years little to no consideration at all about relatively mundane things. People say, well, why don't you trust self-driving cars? Why don't you think they're going to make adequate consideration for cyclists? I'll tell you why. Because right now they don't make adequate consideration for cyclists when they're deciding where to put a friggin' plastic pole. So why the heck? What have they done to convince me that they're going to take us into account at all when you're dealing with something that's much bigger with a hell of a lot more money involved, right? Seriously. I mean, they literally don't even bother to consider when they're deciding where to put a plastic post. If, are we putting it right in the middle of where people ride their bikes? Is that going to cause a safety problem? Nope. Never even occurs to them. So, wait a minute. If the government entities that are responsible for road maintenance and taking care of the road infrastructure and are the ones putting these poles there, it's not like some evil corporation is doing it or some private citizen or somebody who just hates bikes. This is the government road safety department and public works department that's putting these things there. If they don't friggin' consider the effect it's going to have on cyclists when they're simply determining where to put a friggin' plastic pole, what makes me think, Google or Tesla Corporation is going to give a hoot? Seriously. If the people whose job it is to maintain the road infrastructure in a safe condition, not some private company that's just looking at their bottom line and this and that and advertising dollars, a government entity responsible for safe maintenance of the roads doesn't even acknowledge that, maybe we shouldn't put this pole here because it's going to be right in the way of where people are riding their bikes. Maybe we should put it somewhere else or think of another way to deal with the problem. Like I said, ticket people who don't use turn signals, then stopping in the street is no longer a normal behavior. And then, therefore, if the driver does see somebody stopped at a crosswalk, his first thought isn't going to be, unsignaled left turning car, I'll pass it on the right. His first thought will actually be, maybe he's stopping for somebody in the crosswalk. Duh. Hello, McFly, anybody home? But the very fact that when you're dealing with something mundane, whether it's, where to put a speed bump and how that's going to affect cyclists, or how you mark the speed bump so somebody can see it if they're going to ride over it on a bicycle or even a motorcycle so they don't lose control and fall. Um, if you're putting these poles by crosswalks because you think you're going to solve the problem of cars passing others on the side when they stop for pedestrians and people don't realize that's why they're stopping. Well, if it never occurs to you that you're putting the pole right where it's going to be a major hazard for cyclists, then maybe we shouldn't trust those same people, let alone somebody else, to make these changes, right? If a government public works department or roadway department is incapable of realizing that cyclists are part of the traffic dynamic and putting these poles there poses a problem for them, if they just never even occurs to them, it's like they're blind. It's like they poked out one of their eyes. Well, geez, if a government public safety and road works department can't, consider cyclists when they're engaged in something relatively mundane, like deciding whether or not to put a plastic pole somewhere, what makes me think, again, that a big company like Google, which has no roadway safety duty beyond simply obeying the laws, like every other private entity, but they're at least not the ones responsible for maintaining the roads in a safe condition. Well, the people who are can't get it right. So what makes me think somebody like Google is going to get it right? And again, when you look at all the small areas where cyclists have basically been ignored, often not only to the detriment of cyclist safety, but just to the detriment of public safety generally. I mean, one of the things people seem to forget is that if it affects one group of road users, it's going to affect others because the roadways are contiguous surface. I might be riding in a different part of the road than the cars, but if there's a problem on that part of the road, what am I going to have to do? Go around it. Now I'm mixing with car traffic more fully. Now it is going to impact other road users. So even if you don't care about the cyclist per se, acknowledging we're here is part of caring about just road users generally, because whatever affects us is going to have some spillover effect to other road users. It's just the degree of myopia and blindness is, it's astonishing. And I wish I could say I'm shocked, I tell you, but the truth is I've been seeing it for years, ever since I began cycling about 2 decades ago. So frankly, at this point, I mean, somebody's going to have to work against 2 decades of bad examples and 2 decades of basically proving that they have no consideration for cyclists, that they've got that to overcome. If you want to convince me that self-driving cars are going to be safe and that there's going to be some mechanism in place to consider cyclists and that we're going to get adequate consideration in the development of one of these new robot car systems and something along those lines, then you have to address the fact that ever since I can remember, going back over 2 decades, I've never seen a single change to the road infrastructure, at least one that wasn't specifically intended to somehow be just cycling related, where cyclists got any kind of adequate consideration. If they're making a general change to the roadway, as far as they're concerned, them meaning the people making the change to the roadway, which is usually a government entity responsible for roadway safety, if they're making any kind of general change to the roadway, generally speaking, cyclists aren't considered at all. Again, we could start with something as simple as deciding where to put a plastic pole. If they can't get that right, and at least consider its impact on the safety of cyclists, what on earth makes anybody think that they're going to get something right when it comes to artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles? Really? So when people ask me as a cyclist, well, why don't you trust these new ideas? Well, because they haven't proved they can get it right when it comes to considering the concerns and safety problems related to cycling when they're dealing with a hollow plastic pole in the street. Why on earth would I think they're capable of getting it right when it comes to, self-driving cars? And the they, of course, in this case, isn't just the public works departments and the road maintenance crews. When you're dealing with something like self-driving cars, it's also big, huge corporations, which have a lot of other interests besides for public safety. Enough said on that topic. So here's my concern. As a cyclist, our concerns just flat out are ignored, generally speaking. Yes, somewhere someone built a token bike lane. Yes, bike share programs exist in some big cities. That's all well and good. But, in a lot of those same cities, those of us who ride just on the street, there's not going to be a bike lane everywhere. And even if there is, it's not going to be necessarily a good design, or it might not be where you have to be on that part of the street for where you're going. If I'm going to be making a left turn, I'm not going to be riding against the curb, etc. So, those of us who are just generally speaking cycling, what we're more concerned about is things like, are laws enforced against bad drivers and dangerous drivers? If somebody kills you, will they get in trouble? That sort of thing. I mean, I heard just on the radio the other day, there was a guy who was responsible for a crash in which a cyclist was killed, and the prosecutor's like, I'm not going to charge him. And, I've heard so many cases of things like that over the years. At some point, I'm sitting here and I'm saying to myself, we've got to change the problem. Now, the ironic thing is I've actually brought that up in the past to non-cyclists, and their response is, well, if the person didn't get charged, it's probably because they didn't do anything wrong. No, they did something wrong. How do I know? They caused a fatal crash for somebody. It's not like the cyclist just plowed into the car. The car caused the cyclist to be killed. So, why? By doing something illegal. Whether it's driving down the bike lane, whether it's making an unsignaled turn, whether it's cutting in front of the cyclist, whether it's not stopping at a stop sign, whether it's being drunk, driving without a license, being here illegally and being behind the wheel, whatever. If you look at various cases like this, the drivers are breaking the law left, right, and sideways, and to then say, well, when a cyclist raises the concern that there's a problem with the law not being enforced, well, the lack of enforcement you're objecting to is actually proof of the fact that there wasn't a problem. Well, no, that's the whole point. I mean, I'm raising the issue of they're not enforcing the law against people who kill cyclists in some places. It's a known problem. If your response is to, well, that lack of enforcement of the law is actually proof that there is no problem, I mean, in a sense, it's a logical fallacy almost akin to the idea of appeal to authority. I'm pointing out that the prosecutor isn't doing his job, which is to prosecute crimes. You're pointing out, well, yeah, but the fact that the prosecutor chose not to prosecute must mean the person didn't do anything wrong. I mean, no, the whole point is they did something wrong and they're not being prosecuted. That's why there's a problem. But it is kind of funny what people will do. They'll just really go out of their way to tell what when I was growing up were called stretchers to try and make their point. And when it gets to the point where you do have to stress the truth like that, somebody's telling a tall tale or a yarn or a whopper or a stretcher to try and make these points. They're just reaching so hard. It's like, will you just admit that there's a problem, right? I mean, it's not like drivers of cars don't kill people. Jesus Christ, But the point is that we can't get it right with enforcing traffic laws, right? We can't get it right with the government, who's supposed to be maintaining the street in a safe condition, deciding to put a frigging plastic pole right where you're riding your bike. What makes anybody think Google Corporation is going to get it right when it comes to, a network of autonomous self-driving vehicles? And that's my point. They've almost never gotten it right in the history of the world as far as cycling is concerned. So why on earth would they start now? You want me to stop doubting things like self-driving cars? Prove to me that if a careless driver recklessly kills me, he will go to jail. Prove to me that if, the government that's responsible for maintaining the roads is going to try and address a problem, like cars passing others at crosswalks, that they'll be able to do so without endangering every cyclist in the street and making it virtually unusable for bicyclists. If you're going to put a speed bump in the street, at least make it so it doesn't send everybody on a bicycle or perhaps even a motorcycle plummeting to their deaths over the handlebars, okay? Prove that when it comes to the little things that you take adequate considerations for the concerns of cyclists, then we'll trust you on big things. But right now, they've got at least, I'm just going back to when I started cycling as a teenager. So, like 20 years. People who've been bicycling a lot longer than me have a lot longer history of this. There's old guys I know been riding for 30 or 40 years. Well, guess what? You think you have a problem convincing me to trust this crap? When I only have 20 years of experience of cyclist concerns being ignored, talk to the guy who's been riding since 1956, all right? because you've got a hell of a long way to go to convince him too. And that's the problem, right? Reality doesn't just spontaneously change. If cyclist concerns were getting ignored by people 5 years ago, 10 years ago, last week, then they're probably going to be getting ignored by people tomorrow, right? And that's the problem. So when people come to me and they say, well, why don't you trust the idea of self-driving cars, that they're going to have some, adequate consideration for the safety of cyclists? Well, because no major change or even small change to the road networks in this country has ever had any serious consideration for the concerns and safety of cyclists, outside of some narrow things that are specifically cycling related. And even those, a lot of times they get it wrong. Bike lanes that are essentially separated side paths and more or less death traps for the people who expected to use them is just one example. So, you want me to trust your self-driving car ideas? I mean, there's still other issues with self-driving cars, the lack of privacy, the fact that somebody, either a corporation or the government, is going to be essentially aware of where you are at all times, that the sensors in the cars interacting together are essentially going to be capable of creating a constantly updating real-time surveillance, system of every street and road and byway in the countryside. The concern about hacking and, what if something goes wrong? I mean, my computer has Windows 10. Okay, my laptop computer has Windows 10. I'm afraid to turn it off now because it's going through one of its update modes. I don't want any updates. I bought the computer a long time ago. If I wanted something different, I'd go back and I'd buy another computer or another operating system for it. I'm happy with what's on there now. I don't want people essentially breaking into my computer or breaking into my house. Well, what happens if when you're driving down the street, your car decides to update itself, right? Or just somebody hacks into it, which is essentially the same thing, if you think about it, because it's being done without your permission at any random time. And you could say, well, okay, the programs would update themselves at night while you're asleep. What if somebody works at night? I mean, I've had to go into shifts at 3:30 in the morning. So I go down there to get to my car and hope it's not working. Yeah, that's going to go over well. I mean, seriously. So, there's a lot of problems that would still be of a concern with, the idea of self-driving cars. Starting from privacy concerns to other safety concerns, to concerns about hackers and malware and just things not working right. But the concerns of cyclists in particular, they haven't even addressed those. Even if they address those, there's still going to be other things to worry about. But in terms of the concerns of cyclists in particular, they haven't addressed those. And they probably never will, right? They still can't get it right. Where they're going to, you know what? You want to convince me that you can handle self-driving cars, that's going to have consideration for cyclists? Then go out and take all those damn orange poles off the street so that when I'm riding my bike, I don't have to keep knocking them aside or dodging them. You know how much it hurts to crash into a plastic pole at 20 miles an hour? Look, seriously, you want to convince me that there's nothing to worry about with self-driving cars? Go out there tomorrow and remove all those orange poles. Then we can start talking. I don't see that happening, okay? One rider out.